It is my honor and pleasure to turn this over to Senator Slade Gorton.
Randall Schriver is a relatively young man, perhaps halfway through his journey through the federal government as a public servant. He started as a lieutenant in the Navy in the intelligence department, went to the Department of Defense, from the Department of Defense to being a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and now back as an Assistant Secretary of Defense. But between his current position at Defense and his previous one in the Department of State, he was in the private sector as a consultant in a partnership with Richard Armitage, a former Undersecretary of State. My relationship with Secretary Armitage was as a member of the 9/11 Commission, when the Undersecretary was one of the witnesses on the biggest and most publicized of all of the public hearings we held. Biggest and most publicized because it took place just about 3 or 4 days after the publication of an expose of the Bush administration by Richard Clarke. Richard Clarke had been the chief terrorism counsel to President Clinton and very much a favorite in that administration. Stayed on for a while with the Bush administration in a lesser position, which he resented, resigned and wrote a book basically blaming 9/11 on President Bush. So when Richard Armitage, who was Bush's Undersecretary of State, stood up to testify, one of my colleagues asked him whether or not he'd read Richard Clarke's book. I gave it a Washington, D.C. read, he said. I looked for my name in the index. I've never forgotten that one, and I have a warm spot in my heart for Randall Schriver's previous partner, and I assume friend. In any event, Randall Schriver is here to be our penultimate keynote speaker to this wonderful 2-day session. And with that, Randall Schriver, whom I have just met.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to say every day at the Pentagon is wonderful and easy and great, but you do get some special experiences when you're in jobs like this. And certainly an honor I'll never forget is being introduced by Senator Slade Gorton. So thank you, sir, for that. And thank you for your years and years of service and your continuing interest and devotion to this region and helping support American interests there. Thanks, Rich and Roy and Phil and everybody who's had a hand in putting this together and facilitating my participation. This is a fantastic event. I'm cognizant that I'm standing between you and the end of it and whatever plans you might have, whatever bars have good happy hour rates, but happy to close the session after what I understand have been very, very excellent discussions. I'd like to talk briefly about our Indo-Pacific strategy and some of the major challenges we're facing and how Department of Defense is implementing our national defense strategy and our new Indo-Pacific security strategy. So last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago at Shangri-La, we issued our new Indo-Pacific strategy report. It is a strategy report. It is not a new strategy, but it is a comprehensive public articulation of how DoD plays its role in implementing our White House-led Indo-Pacific strategy. And we talk, just talk about the Washington read. I know everybody turns to see how their country is mentioned and how we word certain things. And we did take a lot of time and particular care and interest in all that. So naturally, we talk a lot about our unfolding competition with China. But it's important to note it's also nested under a whole of government strategy. We have an important role, but not the only role. So we do talk about our economic strategy. We talk about the whole of government efforts that are being developed. So that's also the purpose of the report, is to explain how we nest under that. Being as such that it's part of a whole of government strategy, it's embedded in our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific and the shared responsibility we have to uphold that. And so we are part of an effort to promote what we view as enduring and widely shared values and principles. These include respect for sovereignty, independence of every nation, no matter its size, peaceful dispute resolution without coercion, free, fair, and reciprocal trade and investment, and adherence to international rules and norms. Sustaining a free and open order will only be possible through the maintenance of a robust and persistent U.S. military presence and credible combat power, as well as the region's collective adherence to international rules and standards. We think these principles are widely shared and supported, but they aren't supported by everyone, and not everyone shares this vision. We understand from not only words but actions and stated intentions that although China has benefited from a free and open order, the CCP under General Secretary and Chairman Xi Jinping's leadership is challenging the rules-based order and is working to transform this order to one that's more favorable to its authoritarian governance model. China is, of course, not alone. We see other challenges in the region. Russia's actions continue to undermine the rules-based order. We have continuing rogue and dangerous behavior from North Korea. We have backsliding toward illiberal governance in countries such as Burma and Cambodia, which challenge norms relating to rights, religious freedom, and dignity. We have persistent and evolving threats by non-state actors and terrorist organizations, and we've seen recent attacks in the region, particularly Southeast Asia. We have emerging threats across a range of domains, including what we regard as relatively new domains in the military space, such as space and cyber. And we have continuing transnational threats, such as natural disasters and the impact of climate change. Chinese ambitions, however, are of pressing concern. As we've outlined in our national security strategy, China seeks to shape a world order that is inimical to U.S. interests and values. They're leveraging their military modernization, they're using influence operations, engaging in predatory economic behavior and statecraft, and coercion to pressure countries to heed its political and security agenda and ultimately reorder the Indo-Pacific to its advantage. So in other words, China's assertive behavior and activities are designed with a clear purpose: to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, to expand the reaches of its state-driven economic model, and to reorder the region to its favor, which is counter to our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific order. This matters because if the CCP's authoritarian approach were to become ascendant, we could see a weakening of regional and global sovereignty of countries and leading potentially to the loss of access to global commons. We could see an erosion and certainly challenges to our system of alliances and partnerships. We could see an undermining of institutions such as ASEAN and its member states. We could see a diminishment of respect for individual and human rights and a potential normalization of the brutal repression underway in places such as Xinjiang and Tibet. And as we've seen just this past week, the people of Hong Kong who bravely spoke out against the controversial extradition bill, which could potentially expose them to China's justice system and further erode Hong Kong's judicial independence. I know Senator Gardner, in his remarks here, addressed that by saying that the demonstrators have shown to the world that Chinese democracy is alive and well and perfectly compatible with Chinese culture and history. So we do see different visions. We do see robust pursuit of their vision on the China side, which we believe puts us now on a path to long-term competition. Our competition with China is being played out in three specific ways. First, the region is increasingly confronted with a more militarily assertive and confident China that is willing to accept friction in pursuit of its interests. The CCP, under the leadership of Chairman Xi, is challenging the rules-based order. We see this clearly in the South China Sea and in Beijing's approach to Taiwan, just to name two examples. With respect to the South China Sea, despite Chairman Xi's pledge made in the Rose Garden of the White House in 2015, China has militarized the South China Sea. They've conducted land reclamation on an unprecedented scale, which involved extraordinary environmental degradation and destruction. They've militarized its artificial features to assert its sovereignty claims in disputed waters. Early last year, China delivered anti-ship cruise missiles and long-range surface-to-air missiles to its Spratly Island outposts, a clear sign that its intentions are not benign. Regarding Taiwan, we see a whole-of-government campaign to intimidate, coerce, and destabilize Taiwan. The CCP is seeking to diplomatically isolate Taiwan by stripping away diplomatic allies. It applies economic pressure by cutting tourism. It seeks to undermine Taiwan's democracy by meddling in its elections. And it applies military pressure through its posture and its increasingly provocative exercises and operations. And we should all be clear in our understanding of the ongoing threats and military coercion of Taiwan is destabilizing not just to Taiwan, but to the entire region. We see China, number two, we see China leveraging its economic instrument of power, such as the One Belt, One Road initiative, in ways that erode sovereignty of other countries with the goal of changing their behavior to align with China's preferences. I know that this has been a focus of your discussions over the last 2 days, and I know it's been noted how China is using economic inducements and penalties and influence operations and implied military threats to persuade other states to comply with its agenda. Although trade has benefited both China and its trading partners, Chinese use of espionage and theft for economic advantage and diversion of acquired technologies to the military remain a significant source of economic and national security risk to all of China's trading partners. One-sided and opaque deals are inconsistent with the principles of a free and open Indo-Pacific. The third line of effort and where our competition is unfolding is we see the domestic governance of the CCP rule as increasingly authoritarian and increasingly cruel where human rights and dignity are concerned. With more than half of the world's Muslim population living in the Indo-Pacific, the United States and the region views the PRC's systematic mistreatment of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims in Xinjiang, including pervasive discrimination, mass detention, and disappearances, with deep concern. We're also concerned not only for human rights reasons, which should be shared universally. We do see potential linkages to security interests. These practices could lead to a radicalization of this population and could potentially lead to terrorism. To suggest that this is mere job training is unbecoming of a country that claims to aspire to great power status. In short, while our competition with China takes place at various levels, what we are really competing for is to sustain a position of advantage so that we can maintain influence within the international and regional order, which in turn allows us to promote, support, and protect a liberal, rules-based order whose institutions, rules, and norms have fostered peace and prosperity for decades. We should note that while we compete vigorously with China, we do sustain military-to-military contacts, the primary purpose of which is aimed at reducing risk and promoting international norms and standards. Competition could and should be peaceful. Sometimes there's a notional understanding of competition that is different. This may, in fact, even be cultural. When Americans think of competition, it can be thought of as good and mutually beneficial. For China, it can be seen as negative, but for us, oftentimes positive. Competition doesn't mean confrontation in all cases, nor must it lead to conflict. We seek to maintain competition as a stable deterrent to avoid conflict. While the United States and China may not always agree, we recognize it serves both our interests to cooperate where we can. So briefly to close, let me talk about how our competition with China is manifesting in the military space and what DoD's approach is to this competition. China appears to have an advantage over the United States and its allies when it comes to escalating from the gray zone to conventional military operations or to pursue quick territorial gains through a fait accompli strategy, which carries significant implications if left unchecked. But for us, this means we must change our mindset. As articulated in our national defense strategy, the focus on great power competition as the primary focus of national security is appropriate and requires a fundamental shift in the way DoD thinks about deterrence and defense. Our goal is to deter China from pursuing a fait accompli and improve our capacity to deter and fight China at the outset of a crisis, so that China understands unequivocally that pursuit of its objectives to reshape the regional and international order will not succeed through non-peaceful means. As I said, this requires a shift in mindset and the types of conflicts we've been preparing for and thinking about and have been engaged in for the last couple of decades. And now we must think about something other than a binary approach of peacetime versus wartime, and more to a mindset of enduring competition, where clear winners and losers are not always evident on a daily basis, and where rules may often be fluid and open to interpretation. We're no longer in a period of overwhelming American dominance, but rather in one in which our armed forces are adapting to fight against near-peer competitors. Thus, instead of expecting to dominate the opponent, our armed forces are learning to expect to be contested throughout the fight while achieving the political objectives set for them. In light of these challenges, we are changing our mindset, and we have issued our Indo-Pacific Strategy report, which details our fundamental approach centered around what we call the 3 Ps: preparedness, partnerships, and promoting a networked region. With respect to preparedness, we are working to increase the lethality of the joint force and posturing ourselves in ways that are more appropriate for near-peer competitors. We're increasing our investments in contested domains like cyber and space and other emerging technologies. With respect to partners and allies, we are interested in allies that themselves are more capable and able to protect their own sovereignty and their own interests, but also partners that are willing to provide access, provide diversification and dispersal opportunities, and help us compete in a region that is increasingly contested by virtue of China's growing capabilities. And finally, promoting a networked security architecture is important. We had, of course, a legacy of a hubs and spokes approach that is reliant on our bilateral alliances. We will continue to mature and develop our bilateral alliances, but increasingly the challenges in the region, the Indo-Pacific region, are inherently multilateral and require collective responses. So we are working on trilateral relationships: Australia, Japan, and the United States. Japan, South Korea, and the United States. We're working with ASEAN as an entity, and this year we'll be conducting our first ASEAN-US Maritime exercise. And we are working through capacity building to be enablers to greater networking in the future. We have an initiative called the Maritime Security Initiative, which is focused on giving capacity to countries so that they can sense, share, and ultimately contribute to maritime security in the region. We support ASEAN member states in this initiative and are very active in developing the future security architecture so that it is more networked. So to conclude, we do see long-term strategic competition with China as the defining challenge of our generation and possibly beyond. Our trajectory is largely driven by the ambitions of Chairman Xi and the CCP elite, and the acquisition of capabilities that they apply toward realizing their ambitions. We remain open to changing this trajectory, and our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific is in fact inclusive and affirmative for any country, China included, who choose to support the enduring principles embedded in our vision. But we should be clear, these are consequential times and consequential decisions we must take. The costs associated with complacency will be extremely high. But the benefits of competing well and competing to prevail are equally high. With that, I look forward to any questions, comments, criticisms, but thank you again, Rich and Senator Gorton, for giving me this opportunity. You tell me. Okay. Sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for coming to speak with us today. My name is Jim Platty, assistant professor with the Air War College and an NARP fellow. You mentioned about cyber and space domains, and I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on what DoD is doing and working with allies and partners in the region to establish norms and deterrence postures in those two domains. Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a new cyber strategy at the Department of Defense, and that strategy does talk about working with partners and allies. We are doing a number of things on space, some of which is well documented in the media, the efforts to create a new Space Force, interim step to create the Space Command. In both domains, if I could lump them together, we have to meet partners where they are. And where they are, I mean, not only in terms of their own capabilities and what they might be able to provide in a partnership and benefit from in a partnership, but also the threats that they're facing. So I think we have a near-term challenge with respect to Taiwan's upcoming election that we need to address in an urgent fashion. And then we have challenges that are of a longer-term nature. We very much want to strengthen our partnership with Japan, which has threats and challenges, but I think has some work to do in terms of developing capabilities. So we also need to fly the airplane while we're building it. So we have a great partnership with Japan that is active, but we need to build the capabilities to better position us over time. We'll think, as our strategy talks about, we need to think about not only protection of our infrastructure and our own capabilities, but we need to also think about how in a warfare sense, these integrate into our overall approach to warfighting and build that into doctrine, et cetera. Sir.
Thank you, Randy. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And next week, President Trump will meet President Xi in Japan. How would you prepare for this meeting in terms of meal-to-meal relations to make the meal-to-meal relations to continue to be the stabilizer rather than destabilizer of the U.S.-China general relations? Thank you.
Sure. We need to not only say that mill-to-mill relations are a stabilizing factor, we need to have activities that actually underscore that and support that. And so we've been asking our Chinese counterparts to do more meaningful work in the areas of a number of activities, but primarily illicit illegal ship transfers to evade UN sanctions. China has voted for those sanctions, support those sanctions, but we need more action from China to take care of those activities that are taking place in Chinese territorial waters. Our representative at Shangri-La, still acting Secretary Shanahan, when he met with Minister Wei in Singapore, presented him with a gift. This was documented in the media, and it was a picture book of North Korean related ship-to-ship transfers that were taking place in Chinese territorial waters. It would be great if we could strengthen our cooperation, military to military, to deal with that real-world problem that is quite pressing and urgent.
Thank you, Secretary. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Yesterday, Senator Gardner stated that he received a hearing 2 weeks ago that Vietnam and the South China Sea could be the first instance of kinetic challenge from China. Do you concur with that? Also that we heard that Chairman Chao of Vietnam may come to visit President Trump soon in July. Has that been confirmed? And if so, is there any steps that the DoD or you would take to help foster the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. to actually stabilize the situation in the South China Sea? Thank you.
Well, Senator Gardner has been a great leader in the Congress on Indo-Pacific issues. His sponsorship and championing of the ARIA legislation was very significant, and we mentioned that in our strategy report as a great example of how the administration and Congress can work together because we are very supportive of the ARIA legislation. His comments on where we may see kinetic action, I think, are reasonable. I hope we don't see it anywhere, but certainly the South China Sea is an increasingly dangerous space given the activities that are going on there. And we've seen periods of higher tension between Vietnam and China, in some cases related to economic interests in the disputed territories. We hope there's not any kinetic action, but those are certainly two hotspots that we keep an eye on. So I think Senator Gardner's comments there are reasonable. With respect to a potential visit from General Secretary and President Trong, I think it remains of interest on our part, and President Trump issued that invitation when Vietnam played host for us in the second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim. We, of course, understand health issues and the necessary period that may be required for the president to recover. So I don't think we're in a position now to talk about specific dates. But at DOD, we are very supportive of strengthening military and defense ties with Vietnam. Last year was a historic year, first aircraft carrier visit since the conflict we have. Secretary Mattis visited twice during a calendar year, including to look at the work we were doing at Bien Hoa to deal with the dioxin remediation, the Agent Orange that was left behind and caused continuing problems there. We have great cooperation on MIA cases where Vietnam is a terrific partner in helping us resolve those cases related to missing service members. So we're very supportive of the relationship, and if that meeting occurs, you can be sure we'll have a lot of input into that agenda.
My name is Sang Min. I'm a reporter from the Radio Free Asia. Tomorrow, the President Xi Jinping are going to visit North Korea. So I want to know how to see his visit to North Korea. Do you think it will be helpful for the United States to restart negotiating North Korea? And the second question is that today, the Stephen Biegun, Special Envoy for North Korea, mentioned that U.S. and DPRK does not agree the definition of denuclearization. So can you tell me how different definition of denuclearization between United States and DPRK?
On your first question, we await the results of that visit. I know Xi Jinping, at least under his name, an op-ed was released that talked about the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations with the DPRK and talked about the importance of that relationship. It's our hope that Xi Jinping is able to use whatever influence he may have in that relationship to persuade the DPRK to re-engage in a meaningful way on denuclearization. I can't amend or improve upon Steve Biegun's words in any way, so I'll leave it at that. But I will say the reason we weren't able to reach a conclusion or an agreement, I should say, in Hanoi was because they weren't prepared to talk in a serious way about denuclearization to include even foundational issues such as a development of a common definition. So I'll leave it at that. Sir.
Mr. Assistant Secretary, thank you. You talked about the long-term strategic competition being this defining challenge of our generation. I'm wondering if the partners that you referred to in the Indo-Pacific Strategy document are really geared up for this long-term challenge. It seems that a lot of the regional partners, while sort of wary of China, are counting on a pretty strong economic relationship with China to fuel their own internal growth, to solve some of their own internal challenges. I'm thinking in particular of India. So I'm wondering how they reconcile that.
Well, we all have important trade relations with China, ourselves included. So it's qualitatively different. I mean, people sometimes refer to it as a new Cold War. It may share some of those qualities, but I can tell you that it'll be different if we're in this enduring state of competition, given how integrated we are in our economic ties, and that remains true for a lot of our partners. I think, we meet partners where they are in a lot of ways, but one thing that we find almost universal agreement on is people want protection of their sovereignty. They want to be able to make decisions from capital free from coercion or undue pressure. They want peaceful approaches to any dispute resolution. Those aren't U.S. initiatives or positions or principles. Those are widely shared, if not universal. So when we find we're engaging on those sets, we find rapid agreement. We don't ask countries to choose between a country like China and us. We do ask if we can support these principles and values and be a partner in promoting them. We don't ask countries to end any kind of trade or economic relations with China. We do say buyer beware, though, if China is approaching with deals that seem too good to be true and potentially involve debt traps and other ways to ultimately gain more leverage and influence over the country in question. Secretary Mattis used to say there's more ways than one to lose sovereignty. You can lose it with a soldier holding your territory with a rifle and bayonet in his hands, or you can lose it through a bad economic choice. And I think the predatory economics we've seen suggest that more awareness is required and countries need alternatives. And that's where we have to step up too, by the way. It's one thing to say, buyer beware, but it's another thing to actually have alternatives. And so through efforts like the BUILD Act, we're trying to enhance our approaches, and we're trying to strengthen our cooperation with like-minded partners, Japan, Australia, India. You asked specifically about India. They jealously guard their non-aligned status. They have an important relationship with China. But I can tell you I see a lot of convergence on the strategic landscape and the kinds of things we need to be doing together to prepare for that. Sir.
Thank you for your remarks. Bob Eichord from the Atlantic Council. On the issue of dual-use technologies and economic military fusion that they talk about, can you say a little bit more about that in terms of how you look at that question, how you're working with industry, U.S. industry, to perhaps increase their sensitivity to that issue? And are you seeing industry being more cautious with regards to this issue?
Yeah, I think in general, awareness is better. And I think that's partly due to our efforts to educate and spread information. You know, frankly, for a long time, we were sort of unwitting partners to China's modernization, including their military modernization, because we didn't have our hands around this. There are some things you can do in sort of a general blanket way to tighten things up, but in other cases, it's going to have to be case by case with particular technologies. So I would say the stage we're at is awareness is better. We're building sort of the infrastructure to have those dialogues on a more routine basis. We're reaching out to non-traditional communities because dual-use technology doesn't always fall in traditional spaces. The Chinese have been creative in finding ways to get technology that's helpful that maybe we didn't originally anticipate would be helpful. So I think we're at a stage where we're starting to get our hands around the problem. I referred to a change of mindset at the Department of Defense. I think in some cases there's a change of mindset that's needed with industry, and in some cases the choices will be stark. You'll have a choice of doing business with the U.S. government or doing business the way that has been done in the past with China. In some cases, it'll be more case by case and working with industry in more collaborative ways. But you rightfully point out that it's an important challenge.
Thank you. So you mentioned that PRC selection interference against Taiwan is the upcoming challenges that we are facing. So my question is, in terms of capacity building, what could Taiwan do to counter PRC's cyber attacks and disinformation campaign? Thank you.
It's a very important issue for us. There's no question, at least in our minds, that China will try to meddle. They've done it every previous election. In 1996, it came in the form of missile exercises. In 2000, it was Zhu Rongji's finger wagging and threatening of the people of Taiwan. I think that the challenge is the sophistication on the PRC side is growing, and so what we expect this time is use of social media, cyber intrusions, etc. It starts with dialogue, and I won't get into a lot of details. You probably have some family relations that could tell you more about it than I could. And getting the right experts together, and then as required, we will make direct contributions to Taiwan's capabilities and capacity to deal with this as the election approaches. Ma'am.
Thank you. April Herlevy with CNA and the National Asia Research Program. During your comments on promoting a networked security architecture, you explicitly mentioned ASEAN, but I'd like to hear more about other partners or regional institutions, both in the Indian Ocean and Oceania, that you think the Department of Defense could partner with.
So we're sort of open to a variety of modalities to promote that, including ones that we're not necessarily a direct participant. If there's intra-Asia cooperation, and here I'm thinking of something like the cooperation between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines that deals primarily with issues of crime and potential terrorism, and dealing with the return of foreign fighters, etc. We don't have to be in the room. We don't have to be included in every hyphen relationship, but we do want to support them if they do have requests or requirements. And so even in a case like that, we're not at the table necessarily, but all our partners, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines in this case, know that we stand ready to help them in their efforts. There are other nascent efforts. Indonesia has Our Eyes initiative, which is counterterrorism related. Singapore has the Counterterrorism Information Facility. That's a regional initiative. It's owned by the region. Again, we're happy to play a supportive role if that's helpful. I think when it comes to maritime domain awareness and maritime security, we will be an integral part of whatever we're able to develop over the long haul because of the nature of the challenge and what we can bring to bear, but also how long the pole is in the tent for countries to develop that capability and capacity. We'd be fine if we got to a point where everybody could at least see what was happening in their 12 nautical mile sovereign territory for the maritime states. Even better if they can see and sense out to 200 nautical miles of their EEZs. But what we're really after is where they can see and share. Ultimately, see, share, and contribute, and have assets that can be responding in cases where it's needed. But if we can get to see, sense, and share, that'd be really good outcome. Sir.
Hi, Andrew Yo, Catholic University of America. You mentioned under partnerships that you want to see allies build up their own capacity. I know that's been a big thing with the Trump administration. Have you seen allies with our traditional bilateral alliance partners or in Southeast Asia? Have you seen these partners stepping up, or has there been a boost in capabilities, or what progress have we seen there? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to disaggregate and almost go country by country, but I think the general trend is toward more investment and an understanding and a willingness to share a larger portion of the burden. I think Japan is probably, or I should say, perhaps the best example of that. Japan is increasing not only its investments and its resources in its defense, but is also doing things post reinterpretation of Article 9 of its Constitution to be more proactive in the region, be able to take on not only its own defenses and protection of its own sovereign territories, but as Prime Minister Abe has said, a proactive promoter of regional peace and stability. So we're seeing that in a variety of ways. You know, we're desirous of countries meeting certain fair standards, and our president has been clear about that. I don't think he's going to back off anytime soon. So, you know, we'll continue at the Department of Defense to be a voice for that as well. But the real key in our mind is not just how much you're spending, but what type of capabilities are you investing in. And so when we talk about capacity building, it is with a purpose. It is designed, on the one hand, as I mentioned, to enhance maritime domain awareness and maritime security, counterterrorism, you know, these key areas. Sure.
VOA, Libo Liu. I have a question. Acting Secretary Shanahan has said famously, China, 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 when he was asked what the top issue at the Pentagon is. Do you expect Secretary Esper to do the same thing? Thanks.
I would expect continuity in support of an implementation of our national defense strategy. Certainly haven't seen anything that would suggest otherwise. And in fact, Secretary Esper, as Secretary of the Army, has been a key contributor to our efforts to implement the national defense strategy. He is somebody with substantial knowledge of the region and China. In fact, he and I used to teach a university course together on China. He's been a part of this administration's efforts, and so I don't see anything that would suggest we're not going to see continuity, but he'll have his chance if he's either acting or ultimately the nominee to put his mark on things. But from everything I see, he's committed to continuity on this front in particular. Sir.
Thank you, Randy. I think the first Indo-Pacific Strategy report is very historic, as well as 3P strategy, and including calling Taiwan a country for the first time in 40 years in the United States, I think. I have been wondering, what is DoD's strategy over cybersecurity, including 5G, because China is trying to dominate the cyber world? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Our Department of Defense has put out a strategy for cyber, and it's, as I mentioned, it's partly a development of our own capabilities to protect critical infrastructure, and that's also reflected in our 2020 budget request. It's also about developing new capabilities that can be integrated into our doctrine and ultimately our warfighting that may be of a different quality to have a deterrent effect, not just, in other words, not just protection, but to have a deterrent capability. With respect to 5G and the attention that's been given to Huawei in particular, it's very important to us that we have partners and allies with whom we can exchange sensitive information, that we can have high confidence, that we can plan and operate with high confidence that there won't be leaks or loss of intelligence. So I think we're at a stage now where we're trying to have conversations on the front end and identify where the risks and vulnerabilities may be. Not everybody starts from the same place. There are countries that are significantly invested in 4G technology from Huawei. They start in a different place than somebody who doesn't have that existing infrastructure. But we need to make everyone clear on what the vulnerabilities and gaps may be, and then ultimately what implications might be related to their choices. And again, our interest is in having allies and partners that we can share the most sensitive information and plan and operate with great confidence that it will be secure.